The Oath of Fire, the complete story of Hannibal Barca. Part 1, The Boy Who Swore. My name is Silenus of Caleacte, and I have walked beside gods among men. When people speak of Hannibal Barca in the centuries to come, and they will speak of him, make no mistake, they will tell stories of a demon who brought Rome to its knees, a monster who fed his elephants on Roman flesh, a barbarian who knew nothing but war and destruction. They will be wrong. I knew the man, not the legend, and I am here to tell you the truth before time and Roman propaganda bury it forever beneath layers of lies and myth. It begins, as all great stories do, with a child and an oath. The year was 237 BC, and I was barely more than a boy myself, freshly arrived in Carthage from my native Syracuse, eager to make my name as a chronicler of great deeds. Carthage in those days was a wounded lion, proud but bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The First Punic War had ended 5 years earlier, a brutal 23-year conflict that had seen Carthage lose Sicily, pay crushing indemnities to Rome, and worst of all, watch helplessly as Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica in what could only be called naked theft while Carthage dealt with a revolt of its own mercenaries. The mercenary revolt had been a nightmare. Unpaid soldiers, promised wealth and glory, found themselves abandoned by a Carthaginian government more interested in appeasing Rome than honoring its commitments to the men who had bled for it. 20,000 mercenaries and their families had been slaughtered in what history would call the Truceless War, a conflict of such savagery that even Rome, no stranger to brutality, had been shocked. The man who had finally crushed the revolt and saved Carthage from tearing itself apart was Hannibal Barca, called the Lightning, the greatest general Carthage had produced in generations. I first saw Hannibal on a sweltering summer day in the temple of Baal Hammon, the chief god of Carthage. The temple stood on Bursa Hill, overlooking the twin harbors that made Carthage the wealthiest city in the western Mediterranean. The circular military harbor could hold 200 warships, a fleet that had once dominated the seas until Roman innovation and determination had ground it down to nothing. The rectangular merchant harbor was still bustling with trade ships from every corner of the known world, for even in defeat, Carthage remained rich. But the wealth felt hollow now, built on commerce rather than power, on negotiation rather than strength. The great families of Carthage, merchants and traders all, seemed content with this arrangement. Better to be rich and subservient than poor and free, they reasoned. Better to pay tribute to Rome than risk another war that might destroy everything. Hannibal Barca did not agree. Everyone in Carthage knew it, even if few dared speak of it openly. He had been the only Carthaginian general to emerge from the First Punic War with his reputation intact. While the navy had been destroyed and the army in Sicily had surrendered, Hannibal had fought on in western Sicily, winning battle after battle against the Romans, never defeated in the field. Only Carthage's surrender had ended his war, a surrender he had opposed bitterly. Now he was preparing to lead an expedition to Iberia, that wild land of silver mines and fierce tribes across the sea to the west. Ostensibly, the expedition was to secure new sources of wealth for Carthage, to help pay the crushing Roman indemnities. But everyone understood the real purpose. Hannibal was going to build an empire, an army, a power base independent of the cautious merchants who controlled Carthage's government. He was going to create the weapon that would one day strike back at Rome, and he was bringing his son with him. That was why I had come to the temple that day, along with half of Carthage's nobility and common people. Hamilcar was making a public show of his devotion to the gods before departing, and the rumor was that he would have his eldest son swear an oath as well. The boy was only 9 years old, but in Carthage, 9 was old enough to begin learning the duties of a man. The temple was packed, the air thick with incense and the heat of hundreds of bodies pressed together. I had secured a position near one of the great pillars, close enough to see clearly but far enough back that I wouldn't be noticed. I was, after all, a nobody, a young Greek scribe with ambitions far larger than my circumstances. But I had my wax tablets and my stylus, and I was determined to record everything I witnessed. Hamilcar entered the temple like a storm given human form. He was not a large man, perhaps 40 years old, of average height and build, but he radiated an intensity that made him seem larger than life. His face was all hard angles, weathered by years of campaigning, with eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He wore the purple robes of Carthaginian nobility, but beneath them you could see he still wore his battle scars like badges of honor. This was a man who had spent the last 20 years of his life at war, and it showed in every movement, every glance. Behind him walked a boy, and it was the boy who truly captured my attention. Hannibal, for that was his name, meaning grace of bile, looked like a smaller, softer version of his father. He had the same intense eyes, the same proud bearing, but there was still something childlike about him, a vulnerability that had not yet been burned away by experience. He wore a simple white tunic, and his dark hair was neatly trimmed in the Greek fashion, evidence of the Greek tutors Hamilcar had hired to educate his children. The high priest of Baal-Hamon emerged from the inner sanctum, an old man whose very presence seemed to command silence. The crowd quieted, and the ceremony began with the traditional prayers and offerings. A young bull was led forward, garlanded with flowers, and I watched as the boy Hannibal's eyes widened at the sight. Had he ever seen a sacrifice before? I wondered, was he afraid? The bull was sacrificed with practiced efficiency, its blood collected in golden bowls and poured over the altar. The priest chanted the ancient prayers in the old Phoenician tongue, calling on Baal and Tanit and all the gods of Carthage to bless this expedition, to grant Hamilcar victory over his enemies, to ensure the prosperity of Carthage. It was all very traditional, very proper, very boring to anyone who had seen such ceremonies before. But then something happened that was not traditional at all. Hamilcar stepped forward and raised his hand, silencing the priest. The old man looked annoyed but stepped back, yielding to the general's authority. Hamilcar's voice rang out across the temple, speaking in Punic so that all could understand, not the archaic language of the prayers. "People of Carthage," he said, and his voice was like iron wrapped in silk, strong but smooth, commanding absolute attention. "I go to Iberia not as a merchant seeking profit, though profit we shall find. I go not as a politician seeking glory, though glory there may be. I go as a soldier of Carthage, as a man who has seen our city humbled and degraded by an enemy that understands only strength. I go to build something that Carthage has forgotten how to build, power." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was dangerously close to treason, to criticizing the government openly. But Hamilcar's reputation protected him. He had saved Carthage from the mercenaries. He had never been defeated by Rome. He could say things that would have gotten anyone else executed. "I take my son with me," Hamilcar continued, placing his hand on Hannibal's shoulder. The boy stood straighter, trying to look brave, trying to be worthy of his father's pride. I take him so that he may learn what it means to be a true son of Carthage, so that he may see with his own eyes what we have lost and what we must regain. But before we leave, before we board the ships that will carry us to a new land, I ask that he make an oath before the gods and before all of you gathered here. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. I leaned forward, my stylus ready, my heart pounding with the excitement of witnessing history being made. "Hannibal," Hamilcar said, his voice softer now but somehow more intense, speaking to his son but ensuring the entire temple could hear. "Come to the altar. Place your hand upon the sacred stone." The boy walked forward, his steps measured and deliberate. He was trying not to show fear, but I could see his hands trembling slightly as he reached out and pressed his palm against the altar, still warm and wet with the bull's blood. His hand looked so small against the massive stone, a child's hand touching something ancient and terrible. "Swear to me," Hamilcar commanded, and now his voice was hard again, the voice of a general giving orders that could not be questioned. "Swear to me before Baal and Tanit, before all the gods of our ancestors, before all these witnesses, that you will never be a friend to Rome. Swear that as long as blood flows through your veins, as long as breath fills your lungs, you will be Rome's enemy. Swear that you will devote your life to opposing their tyranny, to fighting their expansion, to avenging the humiliation they have inflicted upon us. Swear this, my son, and I will take you with me to Iberia. Refuse, and you will remain here, safe and powerless, while others fight for Carthage's future." The temple was absolutely silent. Even the priests seemed shocked by the boldness of what Hamilcar was demanding. To make a 9-year-old boy swear eternal enmity to the most powerful state in the Mediterranean? To bind him with an oath before the gods to a life of conflict and danger? It was unprecedented and it was madness. But the boy did not hesitate. His voice rang out clear and strong, without a trace of doubt or fear. "I swear it." "Louder," Hamilcar demanded. "Let the gods hear you. Let Rome hear you, if their spies are in this temple as I suspect they are." Hannibal's voice rose, filling the temple with its clarity. "I swear by Baal Hammon and by Tanit, by Melkart and by all the gods of Carthage, by the spirits of my ancestors and by the blood that runs in my veins, that I will never be a friend to Rome. I swear that I will be Rome's enemy until my last breath, that I will fight them with every means at my disposal, that I will never rest until either Rome is destroyed or I am dead. This I swear freely and without coercion, and may the gods strike me down if I ever break this oath." For a moment, no one moved. Then Hamilcar pulled his son into an embrace, and the crowd erupted in cheers and shouts. Some were cheering for Hamilcar's boldness, others for the boy's courage, still others simply because they were caught up in the moment and it felt like something significant had just happened. And it had. I knew it even then, young as I was. I had just witnessed something that would echo through history. As the crowd began to disperse and Hamilcar led his son from the temple, I pushed through the masses, desperate to get closer, to hear more, to learn everything I could about this family that seemed destined for greatness or destruction or both. I was young and ambitious and foolish, and I thought that by attaching myself to Hannibal Barca, I could make my name as a chronicler of great deeds. I had no idea that I was signing up for a journey that would consume my entire life, that would take me to the edge of the world and back, that would show me the heights of human achievement and the depths of human suffering. I had no idea that the boy I had just seen swear his oath would become the greatest military commander who ever lived, would bring Rome to its knees, would become a legend that would outlive empires. But I had seen something in his eyes as he swore that oath, something that made my blood run cold even in the heat of the summer day. There was no childish bravado in those eyes, no youthful excitement at playing soldier. There was only pure, burning purpose. This boy had just sworn away his entire life, had dedicated himself to a cause that would likely kill him, and he had done so without a moment's hesitation or regret. That night, I went to the docks where Hamilcar's fleet was being prepared for departure. I had made inquiries and learned that Hamilcar was still looking for scribes and record keepers for his expedition. Greek education was prized in Carthage, and I had been trained by some of the finest teachers in Syracuse. I had a chance, if I could find the right person to speak to, if I could make myself stand out from the dozens of other young men desperate for the same opportunity. I found Hamilcar's chief of staff, a grizzled veteran named Hasdrubal, overseeing the loading of supplies. He was a Libyan by birth, massive and scarred, with the look of a man who had killed more enemies than he could count and would happily add to that total at the slightest provocation. I approached him with my heart in my throat, clutching my wax tablets and sample writings like they were sacred relics. "What do you want, Greek?" he growled, not even looking at me as he checked items off a list. "I want to join the expedition," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can read and write in Greek, Latin, and Punic. I can keep records, draft correspondence, chronicle events. I studied under." "Can you ride a horse?" he interrupted. Yes, I can ride." "Can you hold a sword without cutting your own foot off?" "I've never tried, but I'm willing to learn." That made him look at me, really look at me for the first time. He seemed to be evaluating whether I was worth the effort of killing or just dismissing. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. A harsh, barking sound with no real humor in it. "At least you're honest. Most of you soft Greek scholars would claim to be warriors if they thought it would get them hired. Fine. Report to the ship Melkart's Blessing tomorrow at dawn. Bring only what you can carry in one pack. If you're late, we sail without you. If you can't keep up, we leave you behind. If you get yourself killed, nobody's bringing your body home for burial." "Understood. Understood," I said, trying not to show how terrified I suddenly was of what I had just committed to. "And Greek," Hasdrubal added as I turned to leave. "If you're going to chronicle the general's deeds, make sure you get them right. He doesn't care about flattery, but he cares a great deal about truth. Write what you see, not what you think people want to hear. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "That's the only kind of history worth writing." He nodded, satisfied. "You might survive after all. Maybe." That was how I became part of Hamilcar Barca's expedition to Iberia, how I began the journey that would define my life. I had no idea what I was getting into, no real understanding of what it meant to chronicle a war that would span decades and continents. I was just a young man looking for adventure and glory, hoping to make a name for myself by recording the deeds of great men. The fleet sailed 3 days later, 25 warships and 60 transports carrying 10,000 soldiers, 1,000 cavalry, and 30 war elephants. I had never seen elephants before, and the sight of them being loaded onto specially built ships was something I would never forget. They trumpeted and swayed, clearly unhappy with the whole process, and I marveled that men had found ways to make such massive creatures serve in war. I caught glimpses of Hannibal during the voyage. He was everywhere, curious about everything, asking questions of the sailors, watching the elephants, practicing with a sword under the watchful eye of a weapons master. Even at 9, he seemed driven by a restless energy, a need to learn and master everything around him. His younger brothers were with him, Hasdrubal, Mago, and little Hanno, but Hannibal was clearly the leader among them, the one his father had marked for greatness. The voyage to Iberia took a week, and we landed at Gades, an ancient Phoenician colony on the southwestern coast. From there, we would march inland, subduing the local tribes, securing the silver mines, building the foundation of Hamilcar's new empire. It was the beginning of 9 years of almost constant warfare, 9 years during which Hamilcar would carve out a Carthaginian domain in Iberia that dwarfed anything Carthage controlled in Africa. And it was the beginning of Hannibal's education in the art of war. Part 2. The education of a warrior. Iberia was like nothing I had ever imagined. The land itself seemed to be at war with those who would try to tame it. Mountains that scraped the sky, rivers that flooded with terrifying speed, vast plains where the summer heat could kill a man as surely as any sword, and winters that brought snow and ice even in the southern regions. The tribes who inhabited this land were as fierce as the landscape. Iberians, Celts, and Celtiberians, each with their own languages, customs, and grievances. They were not united, which was both a blessing and a curse for Hamilcar's expedition. A united Iberia would have been impossible to conquer with 10,000 men. But their divisions meant that each tribe had to be dealt with separately, through conquest or diplomacy or some combination of both. It was exhausting, dangerous work that would take years to complete. I watched Hannibal grow up during those years, transforming from a boy into something harder and more dangerous. His education was unlike anything you would find in the schools of Athens or Syracuse. Oh, he had his Greek tutors, and I often saw him studying philosophy, rhetoric, and mathematics. But his real education came from the campaign trail, from watching his father turn warfare into an art form. Hamilcar understood something that many generals never grasp. That war is not just about battles. It's about logistics, diplomacy, psychology, economics, and patience. He taught Hannibal all of it, not through lectures but through example and carefully chosen lessons. I remember one incident from Hannibal's first year in Iberia. We were camped near the territory of the Turdetani, a wealthy tribe that controlled rich agricultural lands. Hamilcar wanted to secure an alliance with them, but the Turdetani were suspicious of Carthaginian intentions. They had heard of Carthage's reputation for treating its allies as tributaries, squeezing them for every coin they could produce. Hamilcar decided to demonstrate that Carthage could be a valuable ally rather than a demanding overlord. When a smaller tribe raided Turdetani lands, stealing cattle and burning farms, Hamilcar marched his army to confront the raiders. Hannibal, now 10 years old, rode with the cavalry scouts. I was there, clutching my writing materials and trying not to fall off my horse. I was never a natural horseman. We found the raiders easily enough. They were camped in a valley, celebrating their successful raid, confident that no one would pursue them so far into the wilderness. Hamilcar surrounded the camp in the night, positioning his men on the high ground around the valley. At dawn, he sent a herald to offer terms. Return the stolen cattle and slaves, pay compensation to the Turdetani, and submit to Carthaginian authority. Otherwise, face annihilation. The raiders, perhaps 300 strong, laughed at this demand. They could see that Hamilcar had fewer than 1,000 men with him. Most of the army was still in camp a day's march away. They thought they could fight their way out or at least inflict heavy casualties before being defeated. They were wrong. Hamilcar had positioned his men not to attack, but to channel the raiders' movement. When they charged up the valley slopes, trying to break out, they found themselves herded into kill zones where Balearic slingers could strike from long range and cavalry could charge down from the heights. It was a masterpiece of terrain use, turning the raiders' own aggression against them. Within 2 hours, the battle was over. Most of the raiders were dead, and the survivors were begging for mercy. But here's what I remember most clearly. Hamilcar granted them mercy. He didn't slaughter the survivors or sell them into slavery. Instead, he gave them a choice. They could return to their tribes as penniless refugees, bearing the shame of their defeat and the knowledge that Carthage had crushed them utterly. Or they could join his army, swear loyalty to Carthage, and share in the wealth and glory that would come from serving under Hamilcar Barca. Every single survivor chose to join, and that was Hamilcar's genius. He didn't just defeat enemies. He converted them into allies, giving them a stake in his success. Within a year, those same raiders who had fought against us were among his most loyal soldiers, and they brought relatives and friends from their tribes to join the growing Carthaginian army in Iberia. After the battle, Hamilcar called Hannibal to his side and walked with him through the aftermath. I followed at a discreet distance, recording their conversation. "What did you learn today?" Hamilcar asked his son. Hannibal thought for a long moment before answering. "That terrain is more important than numbers." "Good. What else?" "That an enemy defeated is a waste. An enemy converted is a resource." Hamilcar smiled, one of the few times I ever saw him smile genuinely. "You're learning, but there's one more lesson here, the most important one. Can you tell me what it is?" Hannibal looked around at the dead raiders, at the Carthaginian soldiers stripping them of weapons and armor, at the captured cattle being herded back toward Turdetani lands. "That war is not just about killing," he said slowly, working through the thought. "It's about achieving objectives. We could have killed all of them, but that wouldn't have served our purpose. We wanted to impress the Turdetani, and we wanted soldiers for our army. So we did exactly what was necessary to achieve those goals and nothing more." "Exactly," Hamilcar said. "Never forget that. War without purpose is just murder. Every battle you fight, every man you kill, every city you destroy, it must serve a greater goal. Otherwise you're just a bandit, no better than these raiders were. We fight to build Carthage's power, to create a force that can challenge Rome. Everything else is just detail." I recorded those words, not knowing how they would shape the man Hannibal would become. But looking back now, I can see that they defined his entire approach to warfare. He never fought for glory or personal satisfaction. Every battle, every maneuver, Every risk he took was calculated to advance toward his ultimate goal, the destruction of Roman power. The years passed, and Hannibal grew from a boy into a young man. By the time he was 15, he was leading cavalry patrols. By 18, he commanded entire wings of the army in major battles. His rise was not due to favoritism. Hamilcar would not have tolerated incompetence from his son any more than from anyone else. Hannibal earned his position through skill, courage, and an almost supernatural ability to read battlefields. I watched him develop what would become his signature tactical style: careful reconnaissance, exploitation of terrain, precise timing, and the use of feints and traps to lure enemies into vulnerable positions. He studied every battle obsessively, learning from both victories and defeats. When Carthaginian forces lost a skirmish to a tribe using guerrilla tactics, Hannibal spent weeks with the survivors, learning exactly what had gone wrong and how to counter such tactics in the future. He also developed a remarkable ability to inspire loyalty. Soldiers loved him in a way they never loved his father. Hamilcar was respected, feared, obeyed without question, but Hannibal was beloved. Part of it was his personal courage. He never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He ate the same food, slept in the same conditions, faced the same dangers. When his cavalry charged, he was at the front. When sieges dragged on and supplies ran low, he made sure his men ate before he did. But it was more than that. Hannibal had a gift for understanding people, for knowing what motivated them, what they feared, what they needed to hear. He spoke multiple languages fluently: Punic, Greek, Latin, several Celtic and Iberian dialects, and he made a point of learning about the customs and beliefs of every unit in his army. Libyan spearmen, Iberian swordsmen, Numidian cavalry, Celtic warriors, Balearic slingers. He knew them all, understood them all, could speak to each group in their own language about things they cared about. I remember watching him one evening as he made his rounds through the camp. He stopped to talk with a group of Numidian horsemen, discussing the finer points of cavalry tactics. Then he moved to a contingent of Libyan infantry, asking about their families back home, remembering names and details from previous conversations. He sat with Celtic warriors and listened to their songs, learning the stories of their heroes. He visited the elephants with their mahouts, checking on the animals' health and showing genuine concern for their welfare. "Why do you spend so much time with the common soldiers?" I asked him once. We had become something like friends over the years, despite the difference in our stations. He valued my education and often engaged me in philosophical debates late into the night. "Because they're the ones who will have to die for me someday," he answered simply. "When I order a cavalry charge against overwhelming odds, when I ask men to hold a position knowing they'll be slaughtered, when I send units into ambushes to draw out enemy forces, I'm asking them to sacrifice their lives for my strategy. The least I can do is know their names, understand their hopes and fears, show them that their lives matter to me as more than just pieces on a game board." "Your father doesn't do that," I observed. "My father commands through respect and fear. It works, but I think there's a better way. If men love you, if they believe you care about them, they'll follow you into the mouth of hell itself and thank you for the privilege. That's the kind of loyalty I want to build." And build it he did. By the time Hannibal was 20, soldiers who had served under him would have followed him anywhere, done anything he asked. It was a quality that would serve him well in the trials to come, when he would ask his army to march thousands of miles through hostile territory, to cross impassable mountains, to face the most powerful military force in the world again and again despite being outnumbered and undersupplied. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, there was still the conquest of Iberia to complete, and that conquest was about to face its greatest challenge yet. In the summer of 229 BC, Hamilcar led his army against the Oritani, a powerful tribe that controlled the southeastern interior of Iberia. They had been raiding Carthaginian allies and had rejected all diplomatic overtures. Hamilcar decided that they needed to be crushed as an example to other tribes who might consider resisting Carthaginian expansion. The campaign started well. We besieged and captured several Oritani fortified towns, and their main army seemed reluctant to face us in open battle. But Hamilcar grew impatient. He wanted a decisive victory, something that would break Oritani power completely. So he pursued their army as it retreated into the interior, following them to a region of steep hills and narrow river valleys. It was a trap. The Oritani had allied with the Vettones and Vacii, two other powerful tribes. Together, they had prepared an ambush at a river crossing. When Hamilcar's army tried to ford the river, suddenly they were attacked from all sides by warriors hidden in the hills. The battle turned into chaos, with Carthaginian units separated from each other, unable to form proper battle lines. Hannibal, commanding the cavalry, immediately saw the danger. If they stayed to fight, the entire army could be destroyed. He led a desperate charge to cover the army's retreat, his horsemen buying time with their lives while the infantry pulled back to more defensible ground. His horse was killed under him, and he continued fighting on foot until another rider could reach him. Hamilcar saw his son's danger and made the decision that would cost him his life. He personally led a counterattack with his bodyguard, striking deep into the enemy forces to draw their attention away from Hannibal and the retreating cavalry. It worked. The tribal warriors surged toward Hamilcar, seeing a chance to kill the great Carthaginian general. They surrounded his position, and though Hamilcar and his men fought with desperate courage, they were overwhelmed. I was not close enough to see Hamilcar's last moments. I was with the main body of the army, helping to organize the retreat. But those who were there said he fought to the very end, his sword never leaving his hand, his voice still shouting orders even as enemy spears found his flesh. They said his last words were, "Remember Rome." Whether this is true or just a legend that grew up afterward, I cannot say, but it sounds like something he would have said. Hannibal, when he learned his father was dead, did not rage or weep. He simply stood still for a long moment, his face a mask, his eyes distant. Then he began issuing orders. The army needed to be extracted from the trap, organized, and led to safety. There would be time for grief later. Now there was only survival. The retreat was a masterpiece of military skill. Hannibal, though only 22 years old and newly devastated by his father's death, managed to keep the army together, fighting a series of delaying actions that prevented the tribal alliance from destroying the Carthaginian force completely. By the time we reached friendly territory, we had lost perhaps a quarter of our strength, but the army was intact and functional. Could have been much worse. Command of the expedition passed to Hasdrubal, who had married Hamilcar's daughter and was thus Hannibal's brother-in-law. Hasdrubal was a capable administrator and diplomat, but he was not the warrior Hamilcar had been. He understood this and wisely gave Hannibal command of the army while he focused on political matters. Under Hasdrubal's governance and Hannibal's military leadership, Carthaginian power in Iberia continued to expand. Hasdrubal founded New Carthage, a magnificent city on the southeastern coast that would serve as the capital of Carthaginian Iberia. He negotiated treaties, including one with Rome that set the Ebro River as the boundary between Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence in Iberia. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement at the time, a way to avoid conflict with Rome while Carthage built its strength. But Hannibal even then saw it as a trap. Rome wants us to feel safe, he told me one night as we sat in New Carthage, looking out over the harbor where Carthaginian warships rode at anchor. They want us to invest everything in Iberia to build up wealth and power here. And then, when it suits them, they'll find some excuse to say we've violated the treaty, and they'll take it all away from us just like they took Sardinia and Sicily. You think Rome plans to attack us again? I asked. I think Rome plans to dominate the entire Mediterranean, he said. Iberia, Gaul, Greece, Africa, Egypt, they want it all. They won't stop until they control everything, until every nation and every people bows to Roman power. And they'll use any excuse, any pretext to justify their aggression. The treaty with Hasdrubal isn't about peace. It's about giving Rome time to deal with other threats before they turn their attention back to us. Then what do you propose? He was silent for a long time, staring out at the sea. Finally, he said, I propose that when Rome comes for us again, and they will, we don't wait for them to bring the war to our doorstep. I propose we bring the war to them, to Italy itself, to Rome. I thought he was mad. The idea of invading Italy was absurd. The seas were controlled by the Roman navy. The only land route required crossing the Pyrenees, traversing hundreds of miles through Gaul, and then somehow getting an army over the Alps, mountains that were considered impassable by any substantial military force. It was impossible. But Hannibal spent the next 8 years making the impossible possible. He studied accounts of Celtic migrations over the Alps in previous centuries. He sent agents into Gaul to make contact with tribes, to map routes, to establish supply caches. He drilled his army relentlessly, creating a force that could march faster and farther than anyone thought possible. He gathered war elephants, not just as weapons but as a statement of intent. Carthage would do what no one expected, what no one thought possible. And he waited for his opportunity. It came in the form of a city called Saguntum. Part 3, The Die is Cast. Saguntum was a Greek settlement on the eastern coast of Iberia, south of the Ebro River and therefore, according to the treaty with Rome, within Carthaginian territory. But Saguntum had placed itself under Roman protection and was actively working against Carthaginian interests, interfering with our attempts to secure alliances with neighboring tribes and providing intelligence to Rome about Carthaginian military dispositions. It was, Hannibal realized, the perfect casus belli, the justification for war that he had been seeking. If he attacked Saguntum, Rome would have to respond, and that response would give him the excuse he needed to launch his invasion of Italy. But he had to be careful. He needed Carthage to support him, and the Carthaginian Senate was notoriously cautious when it came to anything that might provoke Rome. I watched Hannibal navigate this political minefield with the same skill he brought to military campaigns. He sent careful reports to Carthage, documenting Saguntine provocations and arguing that allowing Roman influence to expand south of the Ebro would undermine the entire Carthaginian position in Iberia. He cultivated allies in the Carthaginian Senate, particularly among the Barcid faction, sending them shares of the wealth from Iberian silver mines to ensure their support. He presented himself as the defender of Carthaginian interests, not as an aggressor seeking war. The Senate, divided and indecisive as always, gave him tacit approval to deal with the Saguntum problem, probably hoping it would resolve itself without requiring them to take a definitive stance. It was enough. In the spring of 219 BC, Hannibal marched on Saguntum with an army of 150,000 men. The siege of Saguntum became my first real test as a chronicler of warfare. I had recorded skirmishes and small battles, but this was something entirely different. A massive military operation that would drag on for 8 months and test every aspect of Hannibal's leadership and tactical skill. Saguntum was extraordinarily well fortified, built on a high hill with walls that had been strengthened over generations. The population was determined to resist, believing that Rome would send help before the city could fall. They were wrong, but their courage and desperation made them formidable opponents. Hannibal approached the siege with characteristic thoroughness. He surrounded the city completely, cutting off all supplies and communications. He brought up siege engines, towers, rams, catapults, and began the slow, grinding work of breaking down the fortifications. He also offered generous terms of surrender. The city could keep its autonomy, pay a reasonable tribute, and its people would not be harmed. The Saguntines refused, believing Roman aid was imminent. In the early stages of the siege, disaster struck. Hannibal was inspecting the progress of a siege tower when a javelin, thrown by a defender on the walls, caught him in the thigh. The wound was serious, driving deep into the muscle. For weeks, he was laid up in his tent, feverish and in terrible pain, unable to walk or ride. The army's progress slowed without his direct leadership, and there were whispers that the siege might have to be abandoned. I visited him during his recovery, bringing him books and news from the outside world. He lay on his cot, pale and drawn, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He dictated orders to his officers, studied maps and reports, and planned the next phases of the siege with meticulous care. His ability to command even while incapacitated was remarkable, a testament to the organizational systems he had built and the trust his officers had in his judgment. The Romans still haven't sent aid to Saguntum, he observed one afternoon as we discussed the latest intelligence reports. They're debating in their Senate, sending ambassadors to Carthage, making threats, but they're not actually doing anything. Do you know what that tells me, Silenus? That they don't care about Saguntum as much as they claim? I suggested. More than that, tells me that they're not ready for war. They know we're preparing something, but they don't know what, and they're trying to buy time to figure it out. They're reactive, not proactive. They wait for threats to materialize before responding. That's going to be their downfall. You sound very confident for a man lying wounded in his tent while a siege drags on, I said, perhaps more boldly than I should have. He smiled at that. A genuine smile, not the thin, cold expression he usually showed. I am wounded, yes, but the siege is progressing exactly as I planned. We're grinding down their walls and their will. They're running out of food, out of hope. They'll fall in a matter of weeks now, and when they do, Rome will have to respond. And when Rome responds, I'll be ready." He was right, as usual. By the time Hannibal recovered enough to resume active command, Saguntum was on the brink of collapse. The final assault came in late autumn, as the first winter storms began to blow in from the sea. The walls had been breached in multiple places, and Carthaginian soldiers poured into the city, fighting house to house through streets barricaded by desperate defenders. The aftermath was brutal. Hannibal had offered generous surrender terms multiple times, and each time they had been rejected. Now, with the city taken by storm, he allowed his soldiers to sack it. This was partly necessity. The army needed to be rewarded for 8 months of difficult siege work, and partly policy. Other cities needed to see what happened to those who defied Carthage and trusted in Roman protection. Saguntum burned, its wealth was distributed among the soldiers, and its population was sold into slavery or scattered as refugees. I walked through the burning city that night, sickened by what I saw but understanding the cold logic behind it. This was what Hannibal had meant when he said war must serve a purpose. The destruction of Saguntum sent multiple messages. To Rome, that Carthage would not tolerate interference in Iberia. To the Carthaginian Senate, that their investment in Hannibal's army was paying dividends. To the Iberian tribes, that resisting Carthage was futile. And to potential allies in Italy, that Carthage had the strength and will to challenge Rome. Hannibal sent much of the plunder back to Carthage, enriching his political supporters and making it harder for the Senate to disavow him. He distributed shares to his soldiers, ensuring their loyalty for the campaigns to come. He kept detailed records of everything, and I helped him prepare reports that would justify his actions to anyone who questioned them. We were preparing for the political battle that we knew was coming, the moment when Rome would demand Hannibal be handed over for punishment. That moment arrived in the spring of 218 BC. Roman ambassadors came to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be surrendered to face Roman justice for attacking their ally. The Carthaginian Senate was paralyzed with fear. Some wanted to comply to avoid another war with Rome at all costs. Others, particularly those who had benefited from Iberian wealth, argued that surrendering Hannibal would be a humiliating capitulation that would destroy Carthage's credibility. The debate raged for weeks. Meanwhile, Hannibal continued his preparations in Iberia, training his army, stockpiling supplies, and sending agents into Gaul to secure the route to Italy. He was proceeding as if war was inevitable, and his confidence became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The longer Carthage delayed in responding to Roman demands, the more it looked like the city was backing Hannibal's actions. Finally, Rome sent another embassy, led by Quintus Fabius Maximus, with an ultimatum. I learned about this scene later from merchants who were present in the Carthaginian Senate chamber. Fabius addressed the assembled senators with barely contained fury, his voice echoing through the hall. "Rome has been patient," he declared. "Rome has given you every opportunity to distance yourselves from the criminal actions of your general. But your delays and equivocations tell us everything we need to know. So I ask you now directly, will you surrender Hannibal Barca to face Roman justice, or will you support his attack on our ally?" The Senate chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to the Sophites, the chief magistrates, waiting for someone to speak. Finally, one of them found his voice. "The decision is Rome's to make, not ours." Fabius reached into the folds of his toga and said, in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Then in these folds I carry both peace and war. Which will you have?" Another Safit, perhaps hoping to deflect responsibility, answered, "Whichever you prefer to give us." Fabius let his toga fall open in a dramatic gesture. "Then war it is." The Roman ambassadors left immediately, and Carthage was at war with Rome for the second time in less than a generation. The news reached Hannibal in New Carthage within days. I was with him when the messenger arrived, and I watched his face as he read the dispatch. There was no surprise, no anger, no triumph, just a slight nod, as if confirming something he had known all along. "It begins," he said quietly. Then, raising his voice so all his officers could hear, "Gather the commanders. We march for Italy." The room erupted in a mixture of cheers and confusion. Italy? How could we possibly reach Italy? Rome controlled the seas, and the land route was considered impossible. But Hannibal had been planning this for years, and now he laid out his strategy with crystal clarity. "Rome expects us to fight defensively," he explained to his assembled commanders. "They expect us to wait in Iberia or Africa while they bring the war to us. They have already dispatched one consul to Sicily to prepare an invasion of Africa, and another to Spain to engage us here. But we will not be here. We will march through Iberia, cross the Pyrenees, traverse Gaul, and cross the Alps into northern Italy." "The Alps?" one commander said incredulously. "With an army? With elephants? It's impossible. So was defeating Rome at sea until we learned how," Hannibal replied calmly. "So was crossing the desert until we did it. Impossible is just a word used by people who lack the imagination and will to achieve difficult things. We will cross the Alps because we must cross the Alps, because Rome will never expect it, because it will bring us into northern Italy, where the Celtic tribes hate Rome and will flock to our banner, because it will allow us to threaten Rome itself before they can organize their defenses." He spent the next hour explaining the details of the plan, the routes his agents had mapped, the supplies he had cached, the alliances he had negotiated with Gallic tribes. It was clear that he had been preparing this for years, working toward this moment with single-minded determination. And slowly, the initial skepticism in the room gave way to belief. If anyone could accomplish the impossible, it was Hannibal Barca. The army that assembled that spring was like nothing the world had ever seen. 50,000 infantry from a dozen different peoples. Libyan veterans who had been fighting under Carthaginian command for decades, tough and disciplined. Iberian warriors with their deadly falcata swords. Celtic fighters from Iberia and Gaul. Massive men who fought with terrifying fury. Numidian light infantry, swift and skilled. 9,000 cavalry, the finest in the world. Numidian horsemen whose skill was legendary. Iberian cavalry with their throwing spears. Celtic heavy cavalry that could smash through any formation. And 37 war elephants, creatures of nightmare to anyone who had never seen them in battle. I was assigned to Hannibal's personal staff, responsible for maintaining records of the campaign. It was an honor, but also a terrible responsibility. I knew I was about to witness events that would echo through history, and I had to get it right. Every battle, every decision, every moment had to be recorded accurately so that future generations would understand what Hannibal had accomplished. The march through Iberia was difficult but manageable. We had to subdue some tribes that had been encouraged by Roman agents to resist us, and Hannibal left his brother Hasdrubal with a significant force to hold the territory and deal with any Roman expeditionary force that might land. By the time we reached the Pyrenees, we had already lost perhaps 10,000 men. Some to battle, some to desertion, some simply deciding they didn't want to march thousands of miles from home on what seemed like a suicide mission. Hannibal didn't try to stop the deserters. "I want only men who choose to follow me," he said. "Men who have to be forced are unreliable. Better to have a smaller army of committed soldiers than a larger force full of cowards and doubters." Before we crossed the Pyrenees, Hannibal assembled the entire army and addressed them in multiple languages so everyone could understand. It was one of the great speeches of history, and I recorded every word, though my transcription can only hint at the passion and conviction with which he spoke. "Soldiers of Carthage," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled thousands. "Behind us lie the lands we have conquered, the wealth we have earned, the homes some of you have made. Ahead lies the unknown, danger, hardship, and suffering. I will not lie to you about what we face. The march ahead will be the hardest any army has ever attempted. We will cross mountains that have never been crossed by a military force. We will face hostile tribes, terrible weather, starvation, and exhaustion. Many of you will not survive." He paused, letting that sink in, watching the faces of his soldiers. Then he continued, his voice rising with intensity. "But those who do survive, those who follow me all the way to Italy, will achieve something that men will talk about for 1,000 years. You will be the soldiers who brought war to Rome's doorstep, who made the mighty Roman Republic tremble in fear. You will plunder the richest lands in the Mediterranean. You will avenge every insult Rome has given to your peoples, every injustice, every act of arrogance and oppression. And you will be rich, richer than you ever dreamed possible." Now the soldiers were listening intently, their fears giving way to excitement. "Rome thinks it can dominate the world forever," Hannibal declared. "Rome thinks that no one dares to challenge it on its own soil. Rome thinks that its legions are invincible, that its system of alliances makes it undefeatable. We are going to prove Rome wrong. We are going to show the world that the Republic can bleed, can be beaten, can be brought to its knees by men with courage and determination." He drew his sword and raised it high, the blade catching the morning sun. "I ask you now, will you follow me? Will you cross the impossible mountains? Will you face the Roman legions in their own land? Will you make history with me?" The roar that answered him seemed to shake the earth itself. 50,000 throats screaming their approval, their commitment, their willingness to follow this man into hell itself if he asked. I felt it myself, that moment of transcendent purpose, the sense that we were part of something larger than ourselves, something that would echo through the ages. Even knowing what I know now, looking back on all the suffering and death that followed, I cannot deny the power of that moment. We crossed the Pyrenees and entered Gaul. The passage through Gaul was a complex mixture of diplomacy and warfare. The Celtic tribes of Gaul were not united. Some welcomed us as potential allies against Rome, which had been expanding into their territories. Others saw us as invaders and tried to stop us. Still others simply wanted to profit from our passage, demanding payment for safe conduct through their lands. Hannibal navigated this complex political landscape brilliantly. He made alliances where he could, offering gifts and promises of future cooperation. He fought when he had to, but always with the goal of minimizing delays and losses. He paid for supplies rather than simply taking them, building goodwill even as we moved as an invading army through their lands. It was a masterclass in how to move a large force through potentially hostile territory. The crossing of the Rhone River was our first major obstacle. The river was wide and fast-flowing, and a large tribe called the Volsi had assembled on the far bank to oppose our crossing. Hannibal studied the situation carefully, then sent a strong detachment upriver under the command of Hanno, one of his most capable officers. The detachment made a secret crossing and came down on the Volsi from behind just as the main army began its crossing. The maneuver worked perfectly. The Volsi, suddenly attacked from behind while also facing an army crossing the river, broke and fled. We secured the far bank with minimal casualties. But the real challenge was getting the elephants across. These massive creatures, already nervous from the long march, were terrified of the water. Hannibal had anticipated this problem. His engineers had built large rafts, essentially floating platforms covered with earth so they looked like an extension of the riverbank. The elephants were led onto these rafts, and only when they were well out into the river did they realize they were on water. Some panicked, including one that fell off its raft and sank into the river. We thought it was lost, but it managed to walk along the bottom, using its trunk as a snorkel, and emerged on the far bank exhausted but alive. It was an incredible sight, and the soldiers cheered when they saw it. While we were crossing the Rhone, we got news that changed everything. A Roman army under the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had landed at Massilia, a Greek city on the coast, intending to intercept us in Gaul and prevent us from reaching the Alps. Scipio had sent cavalry ahead to scout for us. Hannibal sent his own cavalry to meet them, and there was a sharp skirmish. The Numidians, as always, proved superior, sending the Roman cavalry fleeing back to report that Hannibal's army was much larger and more dangerous than Rome had anticipated. Scipio, realizing he had arrived too late to stop us and that he was outnumbered, made a fateful decision. He sent most of his army back to Italy under his brother Aeneas to continue the planned invasion of Iberia, while he himself returned to Italy to organize defenses against Hannibal's invasion. It was a reasonable decision from a strategic perspective, but it gave us a crucial advantage. We now knew that Rome was scrambling to respond, that they hadn't expected us to move so quickly or so boldly. We had the initiative. As we moved deeper into Gaul, heading north toward the Alps, I spent my evenings with Hannibal, helping him compose messages to be sent back to Carthage and to potential allies in Italy. He was already thinking several moves ahead, planning not just the crossing of the Alps but what would happen afterward. "The key is the Celtic tribes of northern Italy," he explained to me one night. "The Romans call that region Cisalpine Gaul, and they've been aggressively expanding into it, taking lands, imposing their system of alliances, crushing anyone who resists. The Celts there hate Rome with a passion that rivals my own. If I can get an army into northern Italy, they'll flock to my banner. That will give me the strength to challenge the Roman legions. And then," I asked, "and then we march on Rome itself," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We demonstrate to Rome's Italian allies that Rome cannot protect them, that alliance with Carthage is more beneficial than submission to Rome." We break the Roman alliance system, isolate Rome, force them to make peace on our terms. You make it sound simple, I said. He laughed at that, a rare sound. It's not simple at all. It's the most difficult military and political challenge anyone has ever attempted. But the alternative is to wait for Rome to destroy us piecemeal, taking Iberia, then Africa, then Carthage itself. We either take this chance, however desperate it seems, or we accept slow death. I choose to fight. And fight we would, though first we had to survive the Alps. Part 4, The Crossing. We reached the foothills of the Alps in late September. I will never forget my first sight of those mountains. They rose like a wall at the edge of the world, snow-covered peaks disappearing into the clouds, looking utterly impassable. Even Hannibal, I think, felt a moment of doubt when he saw them. But he showed nothing to the army, only determination and confidence. The first few days of the climb were not too difficult. The paths were narrow and steep, but manageable for tough, experienced soldiers. The weather was still relatively mild, though we could feel the cold increasing with each day's march. The local Celtic tribes were friendly, providing guides and supplies, happy to help an army that was heading to fight Rome. But as we climbed higher, the difficulties multiplied exponentially. The paths became narrower, sometimes barely wide enough for a single man, requiring us to widen them constantly for the elephants and baggage train. The weather turned savage, with early snowstorms making the already treacherous footing deadly. Men began to slip and fall, tumbling off cliff edges into crevasses where their bodies would never be recovered. Horses went mad with fear on the narrow paths and had to be destroyed. The elephants suffered terribly, their massive bodies never meant for such terrain and climate. And the tribes turned hostile. We had entered the territory of mountain peoples who saw us as invaders to be plundered. They attacked constantly, rolling boulders down on us from above, striking from ambush and then disappearing into the rocks like ghosts. We couldn't chase them effectively. The terrain favored defenders utterly, and we couldn't afford to split our forces. Hannibal organized the march with meticulous care. He placed the cavalry and baggage train in the middle of the column, protected by infantry at front and rear. He sent advance parties ahead to secure difficult passages. He rotated units through the most dangerous positions so that no single group bore all the risk. But despite all his precautions, we were losing men every day. Dozens, sometimes hundreds. The cold was perhaps the worst enemy. At night, temperatures dropped below freezing, and we had to huddle together for warmth. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Men who fell asleep on guard duty never woke up. The Africans, particularly the Numidians who had never seen snow before, suffered terribly. Some simply gave up, sitting down in the snow to die rather than continue the march. I watched Hannibal during those days, and I saw the cost that the crossing was exacting on him. He never showed weakness to the soldiers. He was always at the front during the day, encouraging, cajoling, sometimes physically helping men and animals through difficult passages. But at night, in his tent, I saw the exhaustion and the despair that he refused to let anyone else see. "We're dying up here," he said to me one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're losing 1,000 men a day, maybe more. If this continues, there won't be an army left by the time we reach Italy. Maybe the Senate was right. Maybe this was madness. It was the only time I ever heard him express doubt, and it frightened me more than the mountains themselves. If Hannibal doubted, what hope did the rest of us have? But by morning, his confidence had returned, or at least he showed confidence to the army, which amounts to the same thing in leadership. He called the commanders together and outlined a plan to deal with the hostile tribesmen. Rather than continuing to absorb their attacks, he would take the fight to them. That night, he led a picked force of light infantry in a nighttime assault on the nearest tribal village. The attack was swift and brutal, and by dawn, the village was destroyed and its warriors dead or fled. The message was clear. Attacking Hannibal's army came with a terrible price. The attacks decreased after that, but the mountains themselves remained implacable enemies. 9 days into the crossing, we faced what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. The path ahead had been destroyed by a rockslide, hundreds of tons of stone blocking the way. There was no way around it, no alternate route. We were trapped on the mountainside, supplies running low, men beginning to lose hope. Hannibal stood at the edge of the obstacle for hours, studying it, thinking. Finally, he called for his engineers and explained what he wanted. It seemed insane, but by now we had learned not to question his methods. We gathered every scrap of wood we could find. Branches, pack saddles, anything that would burn, and piled it against the rock face. Then we set it ablaze, creating an enormous fire that burned through the night. When the rocks were heated to their maximum, we poured sour wine on them, thousands of amphoras that the soldiers had been carrying, their precious alcohol sacrificed to break the stone. The sudden temperature change caused the rock to crack and fracture. Then we attacked with picks and hammers, breaking up the weakened stone. Took 2 full days of backbreaking labor, but we got through. The soldiers, who had been on the edge of despair, found new hope in this demonstration that even the mountains themselves could be defeated by human will and ingenuity. If Hannibal could break rocks with fire and wine, what couldn't he accomplish? On the 15th day of the crossing, we reached the summit. The view from the top was breathtaking. We could see down into the plains of northern Italy, green and fertile and inviting after the barren wastes of the mountains. Hannibal gathered the army and pointed down at the lands below. "There," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled thousands. "There is Italy. There is the wealth we have been promised. There is Rome's heartland, which no enemy has violated in 500 years. We have done what Rome said was impossible. We have crossed the Alps with an army. Now we will show them what that army can do." But the descent proved almost as difficult as the ascent. The paths down the northern side of the Alps were even steeper, covered with ice and snow. We had to improvise sleds to transport the elephants down slopes that were nearly vertical. More men and animals were lost to falls and avalanches. The army that finally descended into the plains of northern Italy was a shadow of the force that had left Iberia. We counted the cost. Of the 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry that had crossed the Pyrenees, fewer than 30,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry had survived the Alpine crossing. Of the 37 elephants, only 21 remained alive. We had lost almost half our force, and those who survived were exhausted, frostbitten, traumatized. Many wondered if we had strength enough to face even a single Roman legion. But Hannibal was already thinking ahead, already planning the next phase of the campaign. We rested for several days in the territory of the Insubres, a Celtic tribe that welcomed us as liberators from Roman oppression. Fresh supplies arrived, and the Celtic warriors began to join our ranks, eager for the chance to strike back at Rome. Within 2 weeks, our army had swelled to nearly 40,000 men again, and Rome, caught completely off guard by our arrival in Italy, was scrambling to respond. The consul Sempronius Longus, who had been in Sicily preparing to invade Africa, was recalled with his army. The consul Scipio, whom we had encountered at the Rhone, was raising new legions in northern Italy. Rome was going to throw everything it had at us, trying to crush us before we could fully recover from the crossing. Hannibal needed a victory, and he needed it quickly. He needed to demonstrate to the wavering Celtic tribes that we were a force worth joining, not a doomed expedition about to be destroyed. He needed to show his own men that all their suffering had not been in vain, that they could defeat the legendary Roman legions. And he needed to send a message to Rome itself, that a new kind of war had begun, one that would be fought on Roman soil, and Rome's army was not invincible. The Battle of Trebia would give him all of that and more. Part 5: Blood in the Snow. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the Roman consul, was eager for battle. He had been humiliated by his failure to intercept us at the Rhone, and now he wanted to redeem himself by destroying Hannibal's army before it could threaten Italy. He established his camp near the Trebia River, in the territory of the Celts who were allied with Rome, and sent his cavalry to scout for our position. Hannibal had been expecting this. He understood something crucial about Roman commanders. They were politicians as much as generals, elected to their positions for limited terms, always conscious of their reputations and legacies. They wanted quick, decisive victories that would enhance their standing in Rome. They could not afford to wait, to be patient, to let their enemy choose the time and place of battle. This impatience made them predictable, and predictability was a weakness that Hannibal knew how to exploit. He set a trap and Scipio walked right into it. Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry to raid near the Roman camp, provoking Scipio into sending his own cavalry in pursuit. The Romans chased the Numidians across the countryside, thinking they were winning, pushing the enemy back. Then suddenly, they found themselves facing Hannibal's main cavalry force, appearing out of nowhere in overwhelming numbers. The Roman cavalry was shattered, fleeing back to camp with heavy losses. Scipio was wounded in the engagement, struck by a spear that would have killed him if his son, young Scipio, only 17 years old, hadn't rescued him. The consul was forced to stay in his tent while recovering, which meant effective command fell to his subordinates. Roman discipline kept the army together, but without Scipio's leadership, they were hesitant to engage Hannibal directly. Then Sempronius arrived with his army from Sicily, and everything changed. Sempronius was ambitious, aggressive, and determined to win glory before his term as consul ended. He had no patience for waiting or building up strength. He wanted to attack immediately, to crush Hannibal before Scipio recovered and could claim a share of the glory. Hannibal studied Sempronius carefully, gathering intelligence about the man's character and tendencies. He concluded that Sempronius could be manipulated, that his aggression and desire for glory made him vulnerable to psychological tactics. So Hannibal prepared another trap, more elaborate than the first, one that would exploit every weakness in the Roman military system. The battlefield he chose was near the Trebia River. The land was flat and open, perfect for the infantry engagements that Romans preferred. There was a small stream running through the middle of the field and wooded areas on the flanks. To the Romans, it would look like an ideal place for a traditional battle. But Hannibal had prepared a surprise. He sent his brother Mago with 2,000 picked men, 1,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, to hide in a gully near the battlefield, concealed by brush and careful positioning. They were to stay hidden until the battle was fully joined, then strike at the Roman rear at the crucial moment. On a freezing December morning, as snow began to fall, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry to attack the Roman camp before dawn, harassing the guards, throwing javelins, creating chaos and noise designed to wake the entire army and provoke them into responding. Sempronius, just as Hannibal had predicted, took the bait. He ordered the entire army to arm and pursue the raiders, eager to catch and destroy them. I watched from a distance as 40,000 Roman soldiers poured out of their camp and began marching toward the Trebia River, chasing the Numidians who stayed just out of reach, always retreating, always leading them forward. The Romans had not eaten breakfast. They had been roused too early, too suddenly. They had not warmed themselves or prepared properly. They were already cold, already tired, already at a disadvantage before the battle even began. When they reached the Trebia, they found it swollen with winter rains and icy cold. To reach Hannibal's army, assembled on the far side, they would have to ford the river. Sempronius, committed now and unable to back down without appearing cowardly, ordered his men forward. 40,000 Roman soldiers waded through freezing water up to their chests, soaking their clothing and equipment, numbing their bodies. Meanwhile, Hannibal's men had been well fed, had warmed themselves by fires, had oiled their weapons and armor to protect against the cold and wet. They were ready, fresh, positioned exactly where Hannibal wanted them. The battle began with skirmishing Balearic slingers and Numidian javelin men striking at the Roman line, inflicting casualties while staying out of reach of Roman weapons. Then the infantry lines crashed together in the center, and the real killing began. Hannibal had positioned his forces brilliantly. His Gallic and Iberian infantry held the center, facing the main Roman legions. They were tough fighters, but they were not expected to defeat the Romans directly. They were there to hold, to absorb the Roman assault, to buy time. On the flanks, Hannibal placed his African veterans, the best infantry he had, disciplined and experienced. The cavalry was where Hannibal's advantage was overwhelming. 10,000 Numidian and Celtic horsemen against 4,000 Roman cavalry. The Romans never had a chance. Within minutes, their cavalry was routed, fleeing the field or being cut down as they tried to escape. That left the Roman infantry's flanks exposed, vulnerable to the sweeping cavalry attacks that Hannibal immediately ordered. In the center, the Roman legions were doing what they did best, grinding forward through sheer discipline and superior training. The Gallic and Iberian infantry was being pushed back, taking heavy casualties. For a moment, it might have seemed to the Romans that they were winning, that their superior infantry was going to carry the day despite the cavalry defeat. Then Mago struck. From their hidden position, 2,000 fresh troops crashed into the Roman rear, causing chaos and terror. Roman soldiers, already cold and exhausted, already worried about their exposed flanks, now found themselves attacked from behind as well. Their formations began to break down, their advantages in training and discipline negated by the confusion of being surrounded. The African veterans on the flanks now pushed forward, crushing the Roman wings. The cavalry swept around to complete the encirclement. The trap was closing and the Romans were caught in it. The slaughter that followed was horrific. Roman soldiers, packed too tightly together to fight effectively, were cut down by the thousands. Some tried to break out through the weakest points in the encirclement, but most were trapped and killed where they stood. The Trebia River ran red with blood, bodies piling up in the icy water. Only the center of the Roman line, 10,000 men of the most elite legions, managed to fight their way through Hannibal's infantry and escape. They marched through the Carthaginian center, maintaining formation despite everything, and reached the Roman colony of Placentia, where they found safety. It was a remarkable display of Roman discipline, and Hannibal respected it even as he destroyed the rest of the army. When the battle ended and we counted the dead, we found that nearly 30,000 Romans had been killed or captured. Hannibal's losses were fewer than 5,000, mostly among the Gallic allies who had borne the brunt of the Roman assault in the center. I walked through the battlefield after it was over, and the scale of the killing left me stunned. Bodies lay everywhere, frozen in the snow, their blood crystallized into red ice. Men who had been alive that morning, who had families waiting for them in Rome or the Latin cities, were now just frozen corpses being stripped of their armor by scavenging soldiers. The elephants, those massive creatures that had suffered so much in the Alps, wandered through the carnage, and I thought about the terrible purposes to which human ingenuity could be turned. Hannibal found me standing there, looking at the dead with what must have been horror written on my face. He stood beside me silently for a moment, then spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. "You're wondering if this is worth it," he said. "You're looking at all these dead men and thinking about the wives who will never see their husbands again, the children who will grow up without fathers, the mothers who will weep for their sons. You're wondering what kind of man could order this, could plan this, could feel satisfaction at this result." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I think about that too," he said, surprising me. "Every night, I see the faces of the dead. Not just the Romans, but my own men, the ones who fell in the Alps, the ones who died in Iberia, the ones who will die in battles yet to come. I carry that weight with me always. But do you know what would happen if we didn't fight? If we simply accepted Roman dominance? Peace, I suggested weakly. No. Slavery. Not literal slavery necessarily, though Rome has enslaved entire populations when it suited them. But the slavery of having no control over your own fate, of being forced to bow to Roman will in everything, of watching your culture and traditions be ground down under Roman law and Roman customs. Rome doesn't conquer nations, it assimilates them, erases them, makes them into pale copies of itself. That's what they did to the Greeks in southern Italy, what they're doing to the Celts in the north. That's what they'll do to Carthage if we don't stop them. So yes, this, he gestured at the field of corpses, is terrible. War is always terrible, but it's necessary, because some things are worth fighting for, even at a terrible cost. I understood what he was saying, but understanding didn't make it easier to look at the dead. Still, I recorded his words faithfully, as I recorded everything. Future generations would need to understand not just what Hannibal did, but why he did it, what he believed, what drove him to attempt the impossible. News of Trebia sent shockwaves through Italy and Rome. A Roman consul's army had been destroyed on Italian soil, something that hadn't happened in living memory. The Senate declared a state of emergency. They began raising new legions, calling up reserves, demanding that their Italian allies provide more troops. But they also did something that revealed their growing fear. They refused to negotiate with Hannibal when he sent envoys offering to discuss peace terms. This was crucial. After such a devastating defeat, any normal state would have at least opened negotiations, explored whether acceptable terms could be reached. But Rome refused even to receive Hannibal's ambassadors. It was as if acknowledging the possibility of negotiation would be admitting weakness, admitting that Rome could be threatened in its own homeland. Hannibal understood what this meant. "They'll fight to the end," he told me after his envoys returned. "Rome doesn't know how to negotiate from weakness. Their entire system is built on the premise of Roman superiority, Roman invincibility. They can't admit that a foreign army on Italian soil might be something other than a temporary inconvenience. So they'll keep raising armies and throwing them at us until either we're destroyed or they run out of men. We can't just defeat them, we have to defeat them so completely, so decisively, that their entire system collapses." That winter, we rested in the lands of the Boii and Insubres, Celtic tribes who had fully committed to our cause after witnessing what we could do to Roman legions. Our army continued to grow as more Celts joined us, eager for revenge against Rome. Hannibal spent the winter training these new recruits, integrating them into his army, and preparing for the spring campaign. He also spent time with his officers, teaching them his methods of warfare. I sat in on many of these sessions, and I was struck by how thoroughly Hannibal had thought through every aspect of military science. He didn't just teach tactics, he taught logistics, psychology, reconnaissance, deception, everything that went into waging successful war. "A battle is won before the first blow is struck," he would say. "Victory comes from understanding your enemy better than he understands himself, from being where he doesn't expect you, from forcing him to fight on your terms rather than his. The actual fighting is just the culmination of all the preparation that came before." He was particularly focused on understanding Roman military doctrine. He had obtained copies of Roman military manuals, had debriefed prisoners extensively about how Roman armies were organized and commanded, had studied accounts of previous Roman battles. He understood their strengths, discipline, organization, adaptability, but he also understood their weaknesses. "Romans are predictable," he explained to his officers. "They have a system and they stick to it because it usually works. They form their legions in a standard way. They maneuver according to established doctrine. They expect battle to follow certain patterns. This makes them formidable against enemies who fight conventionally. But it also means that if you can get them into a situation their doctrine doesn't cover, if you can force them to improvise, they become vulnerable. Our advantage is that we have no fixed doctrine. We adapt to every situation, we innovate constantly, we do what they don't expect." As winter turned to spring in 217 BC, Rome prepared its response to Hannibal. They elected 2 new consuls, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius. Servilius was competent if unimaginative, but Flaminius was a political animal, elected more for his popularity with the common people than for his military skill. He was ambitious, vain, eager to be remembered as the man who saved Rome from Hannibal. He was, in short, the perfect target for Hannibal's next trap. Hannibal marched south through Etruria, deliberately ravaging the countryside but leaving Flaminius's own estates untouched. It was psychological warfare at its finest, the implication being that Flaminius had some kind of understanding with Hannibal, that he was perhaps even a traitor to Rome. The accusations flew in the Senate, and Flaminius, his honor and reputation under attack, became desperate to engage Hannibal and prove his loyalty. The route Hannibal chose took us through the Arno marshes, a swampy, disease-ridden region that Italians avoided in the spring. The march was nightmare. Soldiers wading through chest-deep water for days, unable to rest properly, plagued by insects and illness. We lost thousands of men to disease, and even more Gallic allies deserted rather than continue through the swamps. Hannibal himself fell ill, losing the sight in one eye to an infection that he couldn't take time to treat properly. But the terrible march served its purpose. Roman scouts reported our position to Flaminius, and he concluded that Hannibal was making a mistake, exhausting his army in the marshes. Flaminius began to pursue, confident that he could catch us weakened and destroy us. He never suspected that the swamps were just another part of Hannibal's plan. When we emerged from the marshes near Lake Trasimene, we were exactly where Hannibal wanted to be. The northern shore of the lake was perfect for an ambush. Hills on one side, the lake on the other, and a narrow pass that any pursuing army would have to traverse. Hannibal positioned his army in the hills, hidden from view, and waited for Flaminius to walk into the trap. The Roman army arrived at dawn on a misty morning in June. They marched into the pass in column, stretched out along the shore, unable to see the hills clearly through the fog. They thought they were pursuing a fleeing enemy, not walking into an ambush. They had no scouts out, no advance guard properly positioned. It was criminally negligent generalship, but Flaminius was so eager to catch Hannibal that he abandoned basic caution. When Hannibal gave the signal, his entire army descended from the hills simultaneously, hitting the Roman column from all sides. The Romans were caught completely by surprise, unable to form proper battle lines, unable to see where the attacks were coming from in the fog. It was slaughter, not battle. Soldiers were being killed before they even knew they were under attack. I watched from a position on the hills, recording everything I could see through the shifting fog. It was chaos, Roman soldiers running in every direction, trying to find their units, trying to form defensive positions, being cut down as they floundered in confusion. Some were driven into the lake and drowned in their armor, preferring death by water to death by Carthaginian swords. Others tried to fight their way through the ambush, only to find themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. Flaminius himself died in the fighting, surrounded by his bodyguard, trying desperately to rally his men. He died bravely. I'll grant him that, though his pride and recklessness had killed 15,000 of his soldiers, another 15,000 were captured. Only a few thousand escaped to bring news of the disaster to Rome. Hannibal's losses were minimal, perhaps 2,000 men, mostly Gauls who had been placed in the center of the ambush line and bore the brunt of the initial Roman counterattack. It was another perfect victory, another demonstration that Hannibal could defeat Roman armies at will. But still, Rome did not negotiate. Still, they refused even to acknowledge Hannibal's ambassadors. Instead, they appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a special position granted emergency powers in times of crisis. Fabius was old, cautious, and very smart. He understood immediately that meeting Hannibal in open battle was suicide. Instead, he implemented what would become known as Fabian strategy. Avoid battle, shadow Hannibal's army, cut off foraging parties, attack supply lines, slowly bleed the invaders without risking another catastrophic defeat. It was brilliant strategy, and it came closer to defeating Hannibal than any amount of battlefield courage ever did. For more than a year, we marched through Italy with Fabius's army always nearby, watching, waiting, cutting us off from supplies, forcing us to keep moving. We couldn't besiege cities properly because Fabius would attack our siege lines. We couldn't rest because Fabius would cut off our foragers. We couldn't force a battle because Fabius simply refused to engage. Hannibal tried everything to provoke Fabius into fighting. He ravaged the lands of Fabius's political enemies while leaving Fabius's own estates untouched, hoping to raise suspicions about the dictator. He marched his army right past Fabius's camp, taunting the Romans. He staged fake retreats and feigned weaknesses, hoping Fabius would take the bait. Nothing worked. Fabius remained patient, following us like a shadow, waiting for time and attrition to do his work for him. The strategy was working. Our supplies were running low. The Italian cities that we had hoped would defect to us remained loyal to Rome, seeing that Rome's armies, though defeated in battle, still controlled the countryside. The Celtic allies who had joined us after Trebia were becoming restless, wanting to return to their homes. Without a major victory that would break Rome's alliance system, we were slowly being bled dry. But then Roman politics intervened to save us. Fabius's term as dictator ended, and the Roman people, frustrated with his cautious strategy and eager for the kind of decisive action that would end the war, elected two new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Varro was a populist who promised to defeat Hannibal through aggressive action. Paulus was more cautious, but he was overruled by his colleague and by the Senate's demands for decisive action. Rome gave these consuls the largest army it had ever assembled, 8 full legions plus allied forces, totaling nearly 90,000 men. The message was clear: no more cautious shadowing, no more avoiding battle. Find Hannibal and destroy him with overwhelming force. Hannibal welcomed this development. He had been frustrated by Fabius's caution, unable to bring about the decisive battle he needed. Now Rome was giving him exactly what he wanted: a massive army, led by commanders who would fight on his terms. The two armies met near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy. I was there, and what I witnessed that day still haunts my dreams. It was the perfect battle, a masterpiece of military art that will be studied as long as humans wage war. It was also the most horrifying thing I have ever seen. Part 6. The Perfect Battle. The battlefield at Cannae was a relatively flat plain near the Aufidius River. Hannibal had approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The Romans had more than twice that in infantry, though they were inferior in cavalry. By any conventional calculation, the Romans should have won. Their legions were disciplined, well-armed, experienced. Their commanders, despite Varro's limitations, were competent professionals who understood battlefield tactics. Their numbers were overwhelming. But Hannibal was not planning a conventional battle. He was planning something that no commander had ever attempted on such a scale: a double envelopment, a complete encirclement of a much larger force. It was impossibly ambitious, requiring perfect timing, perfect coordination, and perfect execution. One mistake and the plan would collapse, leaving his smaller army to be crushed by Roman numbers. The night before the battle, Hannibal called his commanders together and explained the plan in detail. I was there, taking notes, and I remember the looks on their faces as they realized what he was proposing. Some were excited, others terrified. All were awed by the audacity of it. "We will form our infantry in a convex line," Hannibal explained, using a map spread on a table. "The center will bulge forward toward the enemy, composed of our Gallic and Iberian infantry. They are brave fighters, but they are not as disciplined as the Romans. When the Roman legions hit our center, it will slowly give way, bending backward like a bow being drawn. The Romans, seeing our center retreating, will think they are winning. They will press forward harder, committing more and more of their forces to breaking through what they think is our weak point." "But won't that actually break our center?" one commander asked. "If the Gauls and Iberians are being pushed back and taking casualties, they might actually rout." "They won't rout because they'll know that's exactly what's supposed to happen," Hannibal replied. "We'll explain the plan to them, make sure they understand their role. They're not failing, they're acting as bait, drawing the Romans deeper into the trap. And behind them, forming the hinges of the trap, will be our African veterans, the most disciplined infantry we have. They'll hold no matter what." He moved pieces on the map to illustrate. "As our center bends back, the Romans will compress together, their formations becoming tighter and tighter as they all try to push through the same space. They'll lose their ability to maneuver. Their advantage in numbers will become meaningless because they won't have room to deploy all their forces effectively. And while they're doing that," another commander said, beginning to understand, "our cavalry defeats their cavalry and sweeps around to attack from behind." "Exactly," Hannibal confirmed. "Hasdrubal will command our cavalry on the left, facing the Roman citizen cavalry. He'll defeat them quickly, they're noblemen playing at war, not real horsemen. Then he'll ride all the way across the battlefield to help our Numidian cavalry on the right finish off the Roman allied cavalry. Once both wings of Roman cavalry are destroyed, our entire cavalry force sweeps around behind the Roman infantry and closes the trap. And then," someone asked, though we all knew the answer. "And then we kill them all," Hannibal said simply. "Every single one. We destroy the Roman army so completely that Rome will have no choice but to make peace." Looking back now, I can see the flaw in his reasoning. He didn't understand Rome, didn't truly grasp the depth of Roman determination. He thought that destroying army after army would eventually force them to acknowledge defeat. He didn't realize that Rome would simply raise more armies, that their system could absorb losses that would have destroyed any other state. But that understanding came later. That night, we all believed that Cannae would end the war. The morning of the battle was hot, with a wind blowing dust into our faces. Hannibal positioned his army carefully, making sure the wind would blow toward the Romans, forcing them to fight with dust in their eyes. Every detail mattered. Every small advantage was exploited. The Gallic and Iberian infantry took their positions in the center, forming the bulging line that would draw in the Romans. They knew they were going to take heavy casualties, that their role was to retreat slowly while being hammered by the legendary legions. But Hannibal had spoken to them personally, had explained how crucial they were to the plan, had promised them glory and riches if they played their part. They trusted him completely, and they would hold even as men died around them. The African veterans, dressed in armor stripped from Roman dead at Trebia and Trasimene, formed the wings of the infantry line. They were the trap's jaws waiting to close. The Spanish and Gallic cavalry took position on the left under Hasdrubal. The Numidians positioned themselves on the right, and then we waited for the Romans to begin their attack. The Roman army advanced in perfect formation, a wall of shields and spears stretching across the plain. They were confident, and why shouldn't they be? They outnumbered us more than 2 to 1. They had the finest infantry in the world. They had crushed every enemy they had ever faced. Surely this barbarian Carthaginian, clever though he might be, could not stand against the massed power of Rome's legions. The infantry lines crashed together with a sound like thunder. The Romans pushed forward, driving into Hannibal's center, and slowly, inevitably, the Gallic and Iberian line began to bend backward. The Romans pressed harder, seeing victory within reach. More and more legions pushed into the center, trying to break through completely. I was positioned on a hill where I could see the entire battlefield, and from that vantage point, I watched Hannibal's plan unfold with terrible precision. The Roman army was compressing into a tighter and tighter formation, losing its ability to maneuver. The African veterans on the wings were swinging inward, beginning to threaten the Roman flanks. And on both sides of the battlefield, Carthaginian cavalry was destroying Roman horsemen. Hasdrubal's assault on the Roman citizen cavalry was devastating. The Roman nobles, brave but poorly trained as cavalry, were simply overwhelmed by professional horsemen who had spent their entire lives in the saddle. Within minutes, the Roman left was fleeing the field. But Hasdrubal didn't pursue them. Instead, showing remarkable discipline, he led his cavalry all the way across the rear of the battlefield to where the Numidians were still engaged with the Roman allied cavalry. The combined Carthaginian cavalry force smashed into the Roman allies from behind, and suddenly the battle on that flank was over too. Now Hannibal had his entire cavalry force, 10,000 horsemen, free to execute the final phase of his plan. In the center, the Romans were still pushing forward, still convinced they were winning. Their front ranks had pushed so far into Hannibal's line that they had completely lost formation. Soldiers were packed together so tightly they could barely raise their weapons, and they had no idea what was about to happen to them. The African veterans wheeled inward, attacking the Romans from both sides. The Carthaginian cavalry swept around behind them, forming an impassable wall. And suddenly, 90,000 Roman soldiers realized they were surrounded. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. The Romans, compressed into a space too small for their numbers, couldn't fight effectively. They couldn't retreat because their own men blocked the way. They couldn't maneuver because there was no room. All they could do was stand and die as Carthaginian soldiers attacked them from all sides. I have tried many times to describe what I witnessed that day, and I have never found words adequate to convey the horror of it. Imagine 90,000 men trapped in a space smaller than a large city block, being killed systematically from all sides. The screaming, the smell of blood and excrement, the sight of proud Roman legions reduced to a mob of terrified men being butchered like cattle. It went on for hours, the killing, until the Carthaginian soldiers were too exhausted to swing their swords anymore, until the ground was so slippery with blood that men could barely stand. When it was finally over, when the sun began to set on that terrible day, 70,000 Romans lay dead on the field of Cannae. 70,000. The consul Paulus was among the dead, dying weapon in hand, fighting to the very end. Varro escaped with perhaps 10,000 men, fleeing before the trap completely closed. Hannibal's losses were fewer than 6,000, most of them the Gauls and Iberians who had taken the brunt of the initial Roman assault. It was the most complete military victory in recorded history. Hannibal had done the impossible. He had completely annihilated a force more than twice his size through pure tactical genius and perfect execution. Future generals would study this battle for thousands of years, trying to understand how one man could orchestrate such perfection on the chaos of a battlefield. But as I walked through the carnage that evening, stepping over bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep, I felt no sense of triumph. I felt only horror at what human beings could do to each other, disgust at the waste of so many lives. These had not been evil men. They had been soldiers fighting for their homes, their families, their nation. And now they were nothing but corpses to be stripped of armor and left for the carrion birds. Hannibal stood at the edge of the battlefield, looking out over the field of dead, and his face was unreadable. Was he proud of what he had accomplished? Horrified by the scale of the killing? Satisfied that his plan had worked? Couldn't tell. He stood there for a long time, silent, and then he turned to Maharbal, his cavalry commander, who approached with a proposal. "Lord Hannibal," Maharbal said, his voice filled with excitement, "you have accomplished something that no general in history has ever done. Rome is defenseless. Their armies are destroyed. Give me the cavalry and I will ride to Rome. In 5 days you will be dining in the capital." It was a bold suggestion, and for a moment I thought Hannibal might actually do it. Rome was indeed defenseless. They had no armies left in Italy capable of stopping even Hannibal's cavalry, let alone his entire army. The city was in a panic, with refugees streaming through the gates bringing news of the disaster. If Hannibal marched on Rome immediately, he might be able to take the city by shock and speed, ending the war at a stroke. But Hannibal shook his head. "No. The army needs to rest. We need to tend to our wounded, reorganize after the battle. Rome's walls are strong, and taking a fortified city is different from winning a battle in open field. We need siege equipment, which we don't have. We need to secure our position here in southern Italy, bring over the cities that will now defect to us. There will be time to march on Rome after we've consolidated our victory." Maharbal looked disappointed, and as he walked away, I heard him mutter, loudly enough that others could hear, though whether Hannibal did I'm not sure, "The gods have not given everything to the same man. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Was Maharbal right? Should Hannibal have marched on Rome immediately after Cannae? It's a question historians will debate forever, and I've spent decades thinking about it myself. I believe Hannibal made the right tactical decision but the wrong strategic one. Tactically, yes, his army needed rest, and taking Rome without proper siege equipment would have been difficult. But strategically, the psychological impact of a Carthaginian army appearing before Rome's walls in the immediate aftermath of Cannae might have been enough to force the Senate to negotiate, might have caused the kind of panic that leads to surrender even when walls are still standing. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps Rome would have simply shut its gates and endured a siege, relying on its Italian allies to harry Hannibal's forces and eventually drive them away. Perhaps Hannibal understood Rome better than Hannibal did, understood that they would never surrender, that the only way to defeat them was to systematically destroy their alliance system and their ability to raise armies. What I know for certain is that Cannae should have ended the war. Any normal state, any normal people would have made peace after losing 70,000 soldiers in a single day. But Rome was not normal. Rome did not surrender, and that refusal to accept defeat, that stubborn determination to continue fighting no matter the cost, would ultimately be what defeated Hannibal. Part 7: The Hollow Victory. The news of Cannae sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean world. In Carthage, Hannibal was hailed as the greatest general who had ever lived, the man who had accomplished what everyone said was impossible. The Senate, which had barely supported him before, now fell over itself to claim credit for his success. They sent him some reinforcements, not nearly as many as he needed, but at least they acknowledged his existence. In Rome, the reaction was very different. There was grief, certainly. Almost every family in Rome had lost someone at Cannae. There was fear. What if Hannibal did march on the city? Could the walls hold? There was even briefly talk of negotiation, of perhaps making peace on terms that would at least preserve Roman independence, if not Roman pride. But the Senate, led by men who would rather die than admit defeat, chose a different path. They refused to ransom the Roman prisoners Hannibal had captured, declaring them cowards who should have died rather than surrendering. They began raising new legions from boys barely old enough to hold a sword and slaves freed specifically to serve in the army. They melted down temple treasures to pay for new weapons and armor. They mortgaged the future to continue the war. Most crucially, they sent messages to all their Italian allies, demanding that they remain loyal despite the disaster. And to Hannibal's frustration and disbelief, most of them did. Oh, some of the southern Italian cities defected. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal, along with several smaller towns. But the core of the Latin alliance, the cities closest to Rome that had been integrated most deeply into the Roman system, remained loyal. Hannibal spent the next year trying to consolidate his position in southern Italy and bring more cities over to his side. But he faced a terrible dilemma. To besiege cities that remained loyal to Rome, he needed to stay in one place with his army. But if he stayed in one place, he couldn't prevent Roman forces from gathering and eventually challenging him again. If he kept moving to avoid being trapped, he couldn't take cities. It was a strategic catch-22 that had no good solution. The Romans, meanwhile, learned from their defeats. They stopped trying to face Hannibal in open battle, returning to the Fabian strategy of shadowing his army and wearing it down through attrition. They also began to take the war to Carthage's other territories, sending armies to Iberia and Sicily, forcing Carthage to divide its limited resources between multiple theaters. I watched Hannibal age during these years. The confident young general who had crossed the Alps became harder, more cynical, more frustrated with the situation he found himself in. He had won every battle, Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, and numerous smaller engagements, but he was no closer to winning the war. Rome simply would not give up, would not acknowledge that they had been defeated, would not negotiate in good faith. "They're not rational," he said to me one night, years after Cannae, as we sat in winter quarters in Capua. "I've destroyed 3 consular armies. I've killed more than 100,000 Roman soldiers. I've demonstrated beyond any doubt that their legions cannot defeat me in open battle. Any normal state would have made peace by now. But Rome just keeps raising more armies, keeps sending them against me, as if enough blood spilled on Italian soil will somehow change the fundamental mathematics of military power. Perhaps, I suggested carefully, they understand something you don't. Perhaps they know that as long as they don't lose hope, as long as they keep fighting, time is on their side. You can win every battle, but you can't hold all of Italy. You can destroy their armies, but they can raise more faster than you can kill them. You can take their cities, but you don't have enough men to garrison them all. Eventually, you'll run out of soldiers or supplies or allies, and then they'll have one. He looked at me sharply, and for a moment I thought he might be angry. But then he nodded slowly. You're right, of course. I've always known that. That's why my strategy was never simply to defeat Roman armies. It was to break their alliance system, to convince their Italian allies that Rome couldn't protect them, that aligning with Carthage was in their better interest. But it's not working. The Latins remain loyal, and without them defecting, I can't isolate Rome. I need something more. Some dramatic event that will finally convince them that Rome is finished. That dramatic event never came. Instead, the war ground on year after year in a stalemate that slowly favored Rome. Hannibal continued to win tactical victories. He ambushed and destroyed several Roman armies sent against him. He used clever stratagems to escape from traps. He kept his army intact and dangerous. But strategically, he was stuck. He controlled parts of southern Italy but couldn't expand his territory. He had allies but not enough of them. He had an army but no reinforcements coming from Carthage. The Carthaginian Senate, in its infinite wisdom, was more concerned with other theaters of war than with supporting the general who was actually threatening Rome. They sent armies to try to retake Sicily, which Rome had captured in the First Punic War. They fought to maintain their position in Iberia, which was increasingly under pressure from a brilliant young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio. The son of the consul Hannibal had encountered at the Rhone, and the young man who had saved his father's life at Trebia. This younger Scipio was different from the generals Rome had sent against Hannibal before. He had studied Hannibal's tactics, had learned from Carthage's victories, and was using Hannibal's own methods against Carthaginian forces in Iberia. He won battle after battle, slowly pushing the Carthaginians out of the peninsula. By 206 BC, Iberia was lost. The rich silver mines, the trained soldiers, the strategic territory that Hamilcar Barca had spent decades securing. All of it gone. Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, commanding the Carthaginian forces in Iberia, realized that the situation there was hopeless. In an act of desperate courage, he decided to do what Hannibal had done: cross the Alps and bring reinforcements to Italy. If the two brothers could unite their armies, they would have enough force to finally march on Rome itself and end the war. When Hannibal learned that Hasdrubal was coming, I saw hope in his eyes for the first time in years. This was what he had been waiting for, the reinforcements that would finally give him the strength to deliver the knockout blow to Rome. He began planning how to link up with his brother, how to coordinate their forces, how to use their combined army to maximum effect. But Rome learned of Hasdrubal's approach as well. They intercepted a message from Hasdrubal to Hannibal detailing his route and plans. The Romans assembled an army under the consuls Gaius Claudius Nero and Marcus Livius Salinator, and marched to intercept Hasdrubal before he could reach his brother. The Battle of the Metaurus River was fought in 207 BC, and it was the true turning point of the war, more significant than any of Hannibal's victories. Hasdrubal fought bravely, but he was outnumbered and exhausted from the Alpine crossing. His army was destroyed, and Hasdrubal himself died in the fighting, charging into the Roman lines when he realized the battle was lost, seeking an honorable death rather than surrender. The Romans, in a gesture of calculated cruelty, cut off Hasdrubal's head and catapulted it into Hannibal's camp. That was how Hannibal learned his brother was dead, by seeing his severed head come flying over the camp walls. I was there when it happened, and I watched Hannibal's face as he stared at his brother's head, and something died in his eyes at that moment. Not hope, exactly. He had never been a man sustained by hope, but perhaps the belief that victory was still possible. "So it's just me again," he said quietly, after he had arranged for his brother's head to be given a proper burial. "Just me and an army that shrinks a little more each year, allies who grow less committed with each passing season, and a government that can't or won't send the support I need. And across from me, an enemy that simply refuses to give up, no matter how many times I defeat them." The years after Metaurus were a slow decline. Hannibal continued to operate in southern Italy, keeping his army together through sheer force of will, winning occasional small victories that changed nothing strategically. More and more of his Italian allies defected back to Rome or were reconquered by Roman armies. The war was clearly not going Hannibal's way, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon Italy, couldn't accept that all his efforts had been for nothing. And then Scipio, the young general who had driven the Carthaginians out of Iberia, proposed an audacious plan to the Roman Senate: invade Africa and threaten Carthage itself. It was exactly what Hannibal had done to Rome, turned back against Carthage. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in Africa with an army, and suddenly everything changed. Thank you for listening. Good sleeps.